On a chilly autumn night, when the wind howled through the trees and dry leaves danced in a ghostly whirlwind over the moss-covered ground, the old mansion stood like a dark monolith atop a hill. The sky, shrouded by a blanket of thick, dark clouds, seemed to conspire to hide the moon and stars, leaving the world draped in a deep, melancholic twilight. Its windows, empty and dark eyes, were like silent guardians of the grim secrets buried beneath layers of dust and solitude. Every wall, every brick seemed to carry the weight of countless stories of pain and mystery, and no one dared cross the rusty gates that marked the cursed grounds of the house, for legends and whispers inhabited that place, carried only by the wind. It was as if the very night feared the presence of that place and avoided touching its edges with the softness of darkness. And I, Morticia, the guardian between worlds, the lady of shadows and eternity, felt the presence of lives approaching, their footsteps echoing along the winding road that led to the mansion's entrance. Each soul carried with it the scent of untold secrets, hidden sins, and buried fears. The shadows around me stirred, eager for the arrival of their new prey. I knew that this night would be special, that the newcomers brought stories with them that would echo through the mansion's corridors, adding to the chorus of voices forever trapped there. I waited with a cold pleasure for each sigh, each muffled scream, each lament. The night wore on, and the sound of hesitant footsteps drew closer and closer. 12 young Americans, full of dreams, boldness, and suspicion, approached with a mixture of excitement and fear. They had been invited to a special night, an event organized by the enigmatic heiress of the house, Eliza Marlowe. Eliza, a young woman of 23, had skin pale as porcelain, almost translucent, and her long, dark hair framed her face like a figure from a Gothic tale. She seemed to float through the darkness, her fragile and mysterious presence carrying promises of a unique experience, something that intrigued and frightened them at the same time. The invitations had been sent with an air of mystery and a guarantee of a cash prize for those who accepted the challenge and survived the night. There were promises of thrilling challenges, of a confrontation with the supernatural that they believed did not exist. But those young people had no idea they had fallen into a carefully laid trap, an intricate web designed to ensnare them in a dark game that the mansion had awaited for decades. And I, Morticia, watched each of their steps with silent pleasure, knowing that their fates were sealed long before they arrived. The first to cross the threshold of the mansion was Mark, a broad-shouldered young man with tattoos all over his arms and an air of defiance. He was the type who laughed at superstitions, challenged fear, and mocked legends. His defiant attitude and disdain for the supernatural were, in truth, a way to mask the pain he carried from the tragic death of his twin brother. It was a deep wound, one that haunted him and drove him to seek out risky situations, as if challenging death itself could somehow lessen the guilt and emptiness consuming him. Right behind him came Emily, a young woman with delicate features and curly blonde hair, exuding an almost innocent sweetness. She was the dreamer of the group, a hopeless romantic, and saw this night as a unique opportunity for an adventure that would inspire the stories she loved to write. Emily believed she would find something extraordinary here, an experience worth cherishing, a memory to recount years later. But little did she know that, by the end of the night, perhaps the only fragment left of her would be a whisper within the mansion's haunted walls. Jack, the third to enter, was an aspiring actor, always clutching a camera he rarely let go of. He saw this event as precious material for his video channel, a chance to boost his popularity. Vain and obsessed with his image, Jack believed he was destined for success, as if the world revolved around his talent. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he recorded every detail of the place, but that sparkle would soon fade, leaving only the reflection of a fear he would never fully understand. As soon as the 12 young people crossed the entrance threshold, the doors shut with a deafening bang, as if the house itself were alive and welcoming them into its domain. It was a sound that echoed down the corridors, reverberating in the visitors' souls, making the air even denser and more oppressive. They exchanged glances, some nervous, others still laughing, trying to lighten the weight of the growing fear. Eliza, with her ethereal stride, led them into the living room, where ancient chandeliers hung from the ceiling like claws, casting dancing shadows on the walls covered in faded, dusty tapestries. Decaying furniture, blanketed by a thin layer of dust, surrounded the room, while an unlit fireplace, like a frozen heart, seemed to guard secrets and whispers of the past. "Welcome," said Eliza with a cold smile, her penetrating gaze observing each one of them. Her voice carried a tone of both promise and threat, causing some to shudder involuntarily. "Tonight will be unforgettable. I hope you're all ready for what's to come. What exactly do we have to do? Asked Samantha, a young woman with sharp features, a penetrating gaze, and a challenging stance. She was a psychology student, fascinated by paranormal phenomena, but with an analytical mind and a skepticism that made her dismiss any superstition. Eliza looked at her with an inscrutable smile before responding, letting her words linger in the air like an omen. You'll find out soon enough, she said, still enigmatic. Each of you will face a personal challenge, something that will reach deep into your soul. The lights in the hall flickered, and a muffled murmur echoed through the walls, as if the house were laughing at her words, anticipating the spectacle about to begin. Michael, a young man with dark hair and deep-set eyes, merely smirked, as though it were all a cheap theatrical performance. Cynical and indifferent, he wore an arrogant facade that hid an inner bitterness. For Michael, life had already shown him its cruelest face, and he believed himself immune to any tricks of fear. On the other hand, Catherine, a melancholic and introspective artist, seemed to absorb every detail of the environment, as if the weight of the dark energies cloaked her in a suffocating shroud. To her, every painting, every candle, every shadow seemed to whisper ancestral secrets, secrets of pain and suffering that made her heart race. Catherine was a sensitive soul, lost in a world of profound feelings and sensations that few understood, and that place seemed to speak directly to the shadows of her own heart. Eliza began distributing small, ancient cards, yellowed with time, each containing words whispered by the secrets of the guests themselves. She handed a card to each one, her gaze attentive and cold, as if carefully selecting the fate of each person. Is this some kind of joke? He asked, trying to force a laugh that came out shaky and hesitant. But as his eyes ran over the dark words on the card he'd been given, the smile disappeared, replaced by a pale, terrified expression. The message spoke of a shadow, an inescapable presence that had followed him since childhood, something he had tried to forget, a murky and painful memory he preferred to keep buried. It was as if someone had dug into the depths of his soul and unearthed that painful memory, making the nightmare real once more. And in that instant, I, Morticia, saw the weight of a genuine fear rise in his chest, a terror that escaped through every line on his face and made him tremble like a child in the dark. These cards, indeed, were mirrors of the soul, reflections of the anguish each one carried within, hidden beneath layers of pride, contempt, or mere denial. Each of them received the echo of their own torment, a living reminder that the past does not remain behind but clings, like a persistent shadow, to those who try to escape their own essence. And I knew that the mansion yearned to devour those fears, to turn their most intimate pains into palpable, tangible horrors, so they would be consumed by the darkness to the last breath. While Paul was still trying to grasp the dark meaning of his card, Sarah, the timid young woman who always seemed slightly on the edge of the group, trembled slightly, the yellowed paper between her thin, pale hands, her eyes wide as she read her sentence. The message spoke of abandonment, loneliness, and rejection, feelings she knew deeply and that were as familiar to her as the air she breathed. Since she was a child, Sarah had felt the chill of abandonment, the anguish of loneliness imposed by those who should have loved her but left her in emotional coldness. Now, however, something within her screamed, warning her that her worst fears were about to manifest before her with relentless force, with no chance to hide or look away. And so the minutes dragged on, slow and heavy, like a clock counting each heartbeat in a rhythm of agony. Gradually, the house, this old and insidious entity, began to reveal its true nature. The walls around the young people seemed to close in, almost as if they were breathing, pulsing with a life of their own, while the shadows in the corners lengthened, lurking and contorting into undefined shapes, like faces and deformed bodies emerging from the darkness, a multitude of trapped souls awaiting the next act of their eternal tragedy. The chandeliers swayed gently above their heads in a hypnotic and rhythmic motion, as if they were dancing to an inaudible song, a melody of spectral notes, one that only I, Morticia, could hear in its fullness. It was an ancient call, an old whisper that promised that the night would be long and full of horrors, that each soul present in that house would know the weight of their own sins before meeting the end. And then Eliza, the hostess with a mysterious smile and dark eyes, approached them like a macabre mistress of ceremonies, a figure of perverse elegance who would guide each one into the darkest corners of their own personal hell. With a cold smile, she led Mark down to the mansion's basement, a place where the air was heavy and filled with a smell of dampness and rust. In the center of that dark space stood a huge mirror, dusty and covered with a cloth that seemed to have been placed there decades ago. "Look," murmured Eliza, her voice sweet and cruel at the same time, an almost hypnotic invitation. Mark hesitated, swallowing hard, but his trembling hand pulled the cloth, revealing the mirror. The reflection that appeared was not his own. Instead, he saw the familiar and painful face of his twin brother, tragically dead years ago, his face covered in blood and his eyes glazed over, staring at him with a look of despair and reproach. Mark stepped back, horror written in every tense muscle of his body. He tried to look away but couldn't, as if an invisible force compelled him to stare at that reflection. Then, the reflection began to move its lips, forming inaudible words that etched themselves into Mark's mind like sharp knives, a silent accusation that blamed him for a death he had never been able to accept. While Mark was torn by the horror of his past, Emily was led to a room upstairs, where the walls were covered with portraits of eyeless faces, silent figures that seemed to watch over the room. As she entered, a cold shiver ran down her spine, as if each empty face observed her, delving into her own fears and anguish. With every step she took, the pressure around her increased, a suffocating sense of judgment, as if the figures in the portraits probed each of her secrets. Suddenly, the candles on the chandelier went out, plunging her into complete darkness, where the air was thick and loaded with an oppressive silence. Emily opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by that void, as if the house itself had the power to silence her despair, leaving her at the mercy of the shadows that now seemed to surround her, moving in the darkness. In the main hall, Jack stood alone, the camera trembling in his hands. The pretense of confidence he had displayed was gone. He felt something dark hovering over him, putting him in a constant state of alert. Trying to calm himself, he began reviewing the footage he had recorded so far, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Ethereal figures appeared within the scenes, shadows and translucent faces that hadn't been there before. With a growing sense of dread, he focused on one of these figures, only to realize, horrified, that the ghostly face was his own, disfigured, eyes hollow, skin pale, as if consumed by death. The sight was unbearable, and Jack let out a stifled scream, finally understanding that here in this house he had no control over anything. Not even his own image, now staring back at him with the cold emptiness of death. Samantha, the skeptical psychologist, found herself trapped in the library, an environment where the smell of aged paper and dust was so dense it felt suffocating. The shelves rose high, forming a claustrophobic labyrinth of ancient books, with worn spines and almost illegible titles. Every time she opened one of the books, she found passages that seemed pulled directly from her own mind, words describing her deepest fears, her most hidden insecurities, as if the house knew every detail of her life and was using it against her. With each page she turned, it was as if the walls around her closed in, forcing her to confront what she had always hidden beneath her rational facade. The smell of dust and mildew invaded her lungs, making her feel as though she was being buried alive, trapped in a tomb of words that condemned her without mercy. Eliza continued to move silently through the mansion, observing each expression of horror that formed on the faces of those young people, relishing every fragment of pain and fear she absorbed. For her, this was more than simple entertainment. It was a celebration of the dark beauty that death brings, a dance between life and darkness, a macabre performance where the souls of those young people became the main spectacle. She was the director of this horror show, the orchestrator of a dark ritual that would repeat endlessly in that mansion forgotten by time. And while each of them faced the nightmare they carried within, I, Morticia, waited patiently. I knew that by the end of this night, their souls would be weakened, ready to be reaped, to join the silent chorus of those already dwelling in the shadows of that house, where time was nothing but an echo of eternal suffering. Michael, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy himself at the expense of the fear consuming his friends. He laughed loudly, shamelessly mocking every expression of terror, every wavering glance. "It's a well-made setup, I admit," he said, with an air of disdain, as if he were in a show where he alone could see the reality behind the curtains. Fear was for the weak, he believed, something he found beneath him. And so it went, until Eliza led him, with a slight, enigmatic smile, to the mansion's forgotten attic. Up there, where the air was thick and the smell of old wood mixed with dust and age, Michael kept his sarcastic smile. The attic was dark, with cracks in the walls where moonlight peeped through, casting shadowy beams across the room. The shadows created indistinct shapes, as if something lurked, moving stealthily in the corners. There was a dampness in the air that seemed to cling to his skin, chilling him slowly. Suddenly, he heard the sound of chains being dragged across the floor, a low, almost metallic sound that reverberated in every corner of the attic, making the air feel even heavier. Michael, who had laughed at everything so far, felt a shiver involuntarily crawl up his spine, something he would never admit. Then, in the middle of the attic, an old rocking chair, worn and grimy from time, began to move on its own, creaking in a slow, haunting rhythm, as if keeping time with a melody only it could hear. With each sway, a ghostly sound echoed, as if the very wind whispered secrets long meant to be forgotten. Michael tried to convince himself it was just the wind or some hidden mechanism, a well-executed trick. But then he saw something that stripped him of all bravado and left him breathless. On the chair, a figure slowly materialized, emerging from the shadows, becoming clearer and clearer. It was his mother's face, who had died years ago, a woman he had neglected, whose memories he had buried under layers of indifference and contempt. There, before him, the gaze of the dead woman was a mix of judgment and pain, an expression overflowing with sorrow yet with a severity that pierced him like blades. He tried to look away, but it was as if he was physically unable, bound by those eyes reflecting every word of resentment he had spoken in life, every cold gesture he had directed at her. A wave of remorse, deep and overwhelming, overtook Michael, a feeling he had never allowed himself to feel. Now, however, there was no escape. It was as if his heart were being crushed by something invisible, something pressing down with immense force, making him feel every ounce of the pain he had always evaded. His once mocking laughter had dissolved into a sharp silence, and his sanity seemed to slip away in fragments, slipping through his fingers. While Michael was confronted by the ghosts of his past, the other young people also roamed the mansion's corridors, each facing their own torments. The mansion, in its watchful silence, became a labyrinth of horrors, leading them down paths that went nowhere, turning every corner, every shadow, into threats of incomprehensible forms. The walls closed in with each step, as if they were swallowing anyone daring to pass. Doors slammed violently, the sound reverberating through the corridors like the muffled screams of an invisible crowd. Mark, Emily, Jack, Samantha, Michael, Sarah. One by one they were silenced, absorbed by the house that devoured them with the hunger of an ancient predator. Their screams dissipated into the thick air of dawn, swallowed by shadows that moved around them, as if the mansion were a living entity, ravenous, draining their lives and leaving only emptiness in its wake. Resistance faded, and at some point they gave up fighting, surrendering to the house's dark embrace, allowing it to absorb them, like souls merging with the walls, becoming part of the eternal echoes of that cursed structure. Now they were indistinct presences, silent shadows wandering the halls, prisoners of their own fears, like restless ghosts, condemned to relive eternally the horrors they once tried to bury. And at dawn, an eerie silence reigned. The walls returned to their original forms, unmoving and imposing, as if they had never witnessed the screams and pleas of the night before. The candles went out, leaving only the smell of burnt wax as a testament to what had happened there. In the grand halls of the mansion, silence was absolute, and the twilight enveloped every corner, like a heavy shroud of forgetting. Eliza, the last living figure in that scene, lingered for a few moments, taking in her surroundings with a cold, expressionless face. A subtle, almost imperceptible smile appeared on her lips, a look of satisfaction and triumph. Her dark eyes gleamed with a mix of pride and melancholy, as if she had fulfilled her duty as a dark guardian, a messenger guiding lost souls to eternal rest, or to something far worse. She gave one last look to the house, now more inhabited, its new residents scattered in every dark corner, ready to haunt the next ones who dared to enter that condemned space. With each step she took toward the door, the echo of her footsteps sounded like a farewell, and as she left, she carefully closed the door, locking away not just the horrors of that night, but also the souls of the young people who now belonged to the mansion. And I, Morticia, watched it all, as always, with the ethereal patience only death can possess. I returned to my place, awaiting the next generation of unwitting souls, the next offering of life to fill the vacant, echoing spaces of that mansion. And so the cycle continued, eternal, for in the house where I watch, the end is never the end. It is merely the beginning of another story for death to whisper.